And the realities of GMOs are that the food allergens are well documented. It's extremely rare that we identify new allergens. Nobody's going to take the well-known proteins that cause peanut allergies and do GMOs with peanut proteins with an allergen. I mean, that's just not going to happen. And with any food development, you can't stop the possibility in theory of a new allergen. You just can't stop it. But the probability of introducing a new allergy in a GMO when you are intentionally making one gene change is way less than randomly crossing with many tens of thousands of genes potentially in a wild weedy cross. Antibiotics are not used in GMOs. I just mentioned that in the previous segment. GMOs have actually reduced pesticide usage. I haven't seen the new numbers, and I'm not going to worry about it. I know the numbers have gone up, but 379 million pounds of pesticides were not sprayed because of GMO crops that were already resistant, so they didn't have to spray the pesticides. If we didn't have the GMO crops, we'd spray pesticides on them. Again, from a environmental standpoint, I think GMOs can be used for benefit. There are massive regulatory hurdles. There's no formal testing for any crops formed by mutagenesis or other naturally occurring gene mutations. And you have no idea what they are, or wild crosses. Once created, GMOs are fully fertile and maintained through traditional breeding. They are not somehow foods that are created in a lab and then recreated and recreated in the lab over and over again. No, you do one gene change in one plant, and that one plant is then used in breeding or some other techniques to increase it, to test it, and the great great grandchildren of that GMO plant, if it's successful, will eventually become farmer seed. Now, due to organic restrictions, it can't become organic farmer seed, but it's just another gene, just like any other gene. There's no added chemicals or laboratory work required for GMOs. There is no link or has never been any link to diseases in humans. And that is a huge crock of doo-doo. And the biggest one, I would say, actually, let me tell you two things. One, GMOs cause disease in humans. And then somebody will talk about how some study was done showing, doing a summary of the GMOs out there and how humans are much more likely to have these diseases if they're consuming GMO crops. When you talk about that in a generic sense, GMO crops, and you're not talking about a specific one, immediately that's a red flag. That's a BS argument, and it just throw it away, because, like I said many times already, GMO crops, GMOs are a technique, not a product. You have to look at which gene producing which protein, because you're not eating GMO, you're eating the protein caused by the gene or produced by the gene that was inserted, or the modified protein because of the modified gene. Or you're not eating that particular type of protein because that protein is no longer in the plant because you have a GMO deletion. So the idea that all GMOs, or some study says GMOs are dangerous, is scientifically a bunch of hooey. It shows a complete disrespect for science and for the reader, and people believe it because they haven't been taught properly. If I were to say that this particular GMO in this particular crop is dangerous, then my ears would perk up and go, wait a minute, what's going on? This protein from this GMO product in corn or whatever, in papayas, is potentially dangerous, and here's why. Now I'm going to listen because now that could be true because they're talking about a specific GMO with a specific product from that new gene or modified gene. Um, the other example I wanted to bring up is the idea of many of these studies talk about rats being fed GMO product and um, they formed all of these tumors. And anybody who knows about rats and research, rats in the wild are known to have relatively short lifespans, 2, maybe 3 years. Um, and they develop tumors. And I've had not my own, but with family and friends, I've had many rat friends over the years, and they can be cute, cuddly little friends, and they always start developing these lumps by their thighs and the back of their neck, and they end up getting old and they die of cancer, and that's just really normal rat behavior. And so um, I've seen a number of studies talking about GMOs being fed to rats, and then the rats develop these tumors. You feed anything to rats, and they develop tumors. And if you give them well-known, depending on the genetic type of rat, there are certain dietary uh, processes that will increase the speed and the frequency with which they get tumors. So you feed them a certain kind of diet with higher fat or whatever, and you increase their tumor production rate. And every single one of these studies I've seen has been either they're feeding the rats GMOs and they develop tumors, and there's no control group, or the control group they don't specify that they are the same genetic clone of rats. And so again, it's a bait and switch where you have rats that develop lower levels of tumors and you give them organic food, and then you give the tumor forming rats the GMO food, and then you're not lying. Look, the ones we fed GMO food to died of tumors. And you knew that from the very beginning. Or there was some other things. You're giving rats a way overdose of what was one study? It was GMO sweet potatoes, I think it was, and the other control group was getting a much lower sugar level in the uh, non-GMO potatoes. And if I remember right, it was the researchers that wrote on that were claiming it was the GMOs. The argument from a real researcher was saying, no, 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 no. You fed this group high sugar product and put their metabolism into some strange overload. And of course, they were going to develop tumors faster. It had nothing to do with the GMOs. It had to do with you basically pump them up on sugar. So again, bait and switch. And there's never been a single study I have ever seen, and I've challenged my students in every class where I've talked about this. You show me an article that tells that humans have been harmed by GMOs, and I'd love to read it. So far, not a single student has ever come to me with a legitimate article that didn't just fall apart the instant I started reading it with the most common forms of uh, bad science and fear mongering. So, other realities, GMOs not only are already here, but they've been here for a long time. Decades they've been in our food supply. And what's also weird is that people don't seem to mind it. In every aisle of the grocery store is GMO products in things that you wouldn't even think of. I bet you your cell phone has something that was made. I'm not saying for sure, but I would actually bet that there is something in the manufacture of your cell phone that used a GMO. I wouldn't place a big bet, but I'm pretty darn sure. Um, all kinds of things. We've been exposed to GMOs for a very long time. There's been tons of research on the environmental safety, human safety, et cetera. And there's nothing that has shown a significant risk that outweighs the benefits. And in reality, it actually might be safer than breeding. Who's using it? Again, this data is a little bit old, but the general trend is the same. And you can see here, number one is the United States. We've definitely been at the forefront because of our agricultural research being so strong in the United States. We've pushed it primarily for some of the Midwest crops like corn, where GMOs have been extremely big. But if you look at many of the areas where they aren't showing the use of GMOs, um, either we didn't have the data at the time of this, or um, they weren't reporting it. I'm not sure what the status was of Russia, for example, at this time. Um, but these are the countries that are using it in green, the ones that are saying, no, you're not growing it, at least publicly. Either they're too small, lots of these African countries, they're indigenous populations that are not going to be growing modern varieties. They're growing the historic indigenous varieties of their local communities. And there are some places for political reasons that they aren't growing these GMO crops. But what really sets this off, notice where we have places that are not growing them by the farmer. Now compare that to this, the ones that are importing it. You can't grow them here, but send them on over. We'll buy them. We'll buy a lot of them. Russia buys a ton of it. I believe when I was looking at this data in 2012, Russia wasn't reporting their GMO use in terms of farming it, but it's pretty hard to not know when you're selling it to them. So they're buying tons of it. All of Europe, they're buying it. If it's that dangerous, if it's that bad, then how come they're saying, yeah, sell it to us? We're taking your stuff. We love to buy your GMOs. It's good stuff. Eat away. And the answer is pretty simple. It's money. It's politics. It's not about safety. And you just look at this graph, what's going on in Europe, the areas that don't grow it, in Russia, and even Indonesia, and it's just mind-boggling how the hypocrisy is there when they're arguing out of one side of their mouths how dangerous it is, yet bring it on. So what are the crops in the United States? This might have changed. I haven't paid attention recently. I did add alfalfa and sugar beets. I think we now have a potato. I know we did have a potato. I don't know if it's still on the market. I think it is. I think there's a potato that you would add to this. But, the most part, what do we have? Soybeans and corn and cotton make up the bulk of it. And there are two that we don't talk about too much: squash and papaya. And why don't we talk about squash and papaya? Because there was a virus in squash and a separate virus in papaya that was devastating the agricultural economies of certain third world countries. And papaya is grown largely in third world countries. There's a lot of countries that are extremely dependent, or maybe second world countries, where they're extremely dependent on their agricultural production for their gross economic output for the whole country. And papayas are a significant crop in some of these countries. And that virus was devastating and just causing massive losses. So very, very, very early in GM crops, a couple of university researchers separately, one developed a resistance gene to a really nasty viral disease in squash. Another developed a resistance gene to a very nasty virus in papaya. And both of those were highly successful. They were planted in large numbers. Now, not everybody had to plant it, because if you have a large growing area and you break that growing area up with GMO crops, then the organic crops can live in between the GMO crops. And the only reason the organic crops can survive is because they're isolated by the GMO crops. Another one of those things that people don't realize, the organic community benefits hugely in some cases from GMOs, and they don't give any credit for it. The GMOs and the conventional production reduce the incidences of pests and diseases to a level where some of these organic production facilities can operate, when in reality they would be devastated if everybody tried to go organic. So these were very early. We've got squash and papaya before the no GMO, before the word organic even really gained any traction. Nobody talks about it. The anti-GMO crowd never wants to bring up GMO papaya is bad, because they don't want to be seen as being the bullies against countries that are surviving and have survived a virus problem thanks to GMOs. So if you don't want to talk about a GMO success story, just don't talk about it. Again, GMOs in every single aisle of the store, GMOs in your squash, GMOs in your papaya. Just don't bring it into my fresh produce aisle. But I'll look the other way with the corn. I'll look the other way with the squash. But I don't want it in my lettuce. I don't want it in my tomatoes. Everything else, I'll just put on the blinders. Again, it's hypocrisy. It doesn't make any sense. But you should know from this lecture that soybean and corn are two huge ones. You should know that squash and papaya are two really important stories that I just told you. Alfalfa, sugar beets, those are also important. And potato as another example. There was a couple of tomatoes. I don't think there's anything on the market now. There were a couple of tomatoes in the market, but I don't think at this time there are any tomatoes currently in the market for various reasons. So what kinds of crops? Herbicide tolerant crops, Bacillus thuringiensis crops. Herbicide tolerance, mostly that's Roundup Ready. So instead of spraying another type of herbicide, you can spray Roundup, and the Roundup will kill your weeds without killing your crop. That's herbicide tolerance. So does it change things dramatically? It certainly changes that you're spraying Roundup instead of spraying, or glyphosate, instead of spraying a different pesticide. And in some cases, the Roundup is less toxic than the pesticide you're replacing. But not every example of herbicide tolerant crops, I think, is a good idea. You're replacing, yeah, I'll just leave it at that. I don't agree with every application of Roundup Ready or herbicide tolerant crops. Some are a good idea, some actually help and are better for the environment. Some are more questionable, more economic decisions, because companies can sell more herbicides to you. BT is a gene from a bacteria called Bacillus thuringiensis. And in organics, you can take this bacteria and dry it up into a powder and spray it on your plants, and it's allowed in organics, and it kills moth and butterfly larvae when they eat it. So caterpillars, moth and butterfly larvae die when they eat this bacteria. They don't have to eat the live bacteria. It's a protein in the bacteria called the BT protein that kills them. Well, what have they done? They've put the gene that makes this protein into our plants. So instead of it being on the outside of the plant, it's inside the plant. Our bodies see it as just protein, and we digest it like any other protein, and it's harmless to our bodies. But It is harmful to the caterpillar larvae, moth and butterfly larvae, and they don't digest it properly, and it causes some internal problems and kills them. And it kills them at a very, very, very young age when it's a GMO crop. So they're so small they can't do much damage to the plant. So BT plants are actually very, very effective. I wasn't a fan of this. I think scientifically it's a really interesting story. Finding this bacteria that is toxic to the Lepidopteran pests. The order Lepidoptera is the moth and butterfly order. And then finding which gene actually makes this protein that is the toxin, and then finding out that it's a harmless protein for most animals, but toxic to lepidopterans, and then isolating the gene and sticking it into a plant and finding out that the plants actually can be resistant to lepidopteran pests. Very interesting scientific story. I didn't like it and I didn't support the idea on one hand because organic farmers don't have very many tools to deal with moth and butterfly larvae, and the BT powder or sprays was one of the only tools they had. And if we're now growing BT crops by the hundreds of thousands of acres, insects might start to develop resistance, and that would be bad for the organic farmers because organic farmers don't have any other tool in their arsenal. They don't have another choice of what to do next. The conventional farmers can just spray another chemical. So I didn't like it, and it was like, okay, as long as you regulate it, you only allow it out in certain amounts in certain areas to avoid building up resistance. Did that happen? No. Um, but that happens with conventional chemicals too. We find a chemical that we like, and what do? We way overuse it. We don't do adequate regulation to limit the use of chemicals, so we build up resistance in the population, and then that chemical stops working. So the only thing that's different in this example is that we're doing it again with a GMO instead of an actual chemical that we spray. Um, it's the same concept. It's the same short-sighted thinking or stupidity that we always use when it comes to regulatory processes. And farmers hate regulation, but at the same time, it protects us all if we have rules that limit the use of certain things in a fair way that will prevent a problem of resistance in insect populations. Oh well. But that's what we got. That's the story. GMO crops have been increasing all the way to 2011, and I'm sure that trend has continued up. It's probably flattened a little bit, but it certainly it just continues chugging away as improving for the GM world the number of acres um, that we produce in the United States as it becomes more and more accepted. And really, it is about acceptance. There are political agendas and intentional misinformation. Unfortunately, the organics and health food industries are some of the worst with misinformation regarding GMOs, and that bothers me. I'm very pro organic. I'm on the fence about the health food industry. I think there's a lot of slimy people taking advantage of people who want to do good to the environment, do good for their bodies, and they sell more BS than truth. I think in a lot of the health food industries, there are good things out there. Don't get me wrong. The health food industry has some wonderful products, some wonderful people, but there's some really slimy companies and people as well, and tons of scientific misinformation. And the organic community benefits from GMO fear. They thrive on GMO fear. They don't want the GMO fear to go away. They don't want the truth to come out because if the truth comes out, it just hurts their sales. Why should I buy that tomato, which costs 20% more than the tomato right next to it, if that tomato right next to it is just as good and just as safe? Well, you need something else. You need people to care about the environment. You need people to care about the philosophies. You need people to care about your varieties. Pick a better variety that tastes better. You've got a better product, a safer product. I cry BS. Organics have repeatedly been shown to not be safer than conventional for the consumer. And quite the opposite. There have been more studies showing that organics are actually, from a food safety standpoint, arguably a little less safe. Um, and their big push, be scared of conventional products. Organics are better for you and your kids. You'll be healthier and safer. No, that's not the selling point, but that's what they use because it works. Environmentalists, especially in Europe, we don't have as big of an environmental community that's trying to push the anti-GMO argument here in the United States. It's there, it's just not nearly as noisy and vocal and politically powerful as they are in Europe. Again, generalizing about GMOs, not really telling the truth or talking about specific examples of why there might be concerns. There are legitimate concerns that are being dealt with: allergens, cross pollination, or contaminating crops in rural areas. Antibiotics, certainly. If there were antibiotics, that's a legitimate concern, but guess what? They're not in GMOs. GMO pesticides and the environment, and super weeds or super bugs being developed. All of those things could happen. All of those things it's possible to do with GMOs. Um, but the arguments, the fear doesn't make sense. The GMOs does not make these things more scary, more risky, and they can easily be handled, or already are handled through our current rules, techniques, and legislation. Consumer acceptance is one of the real biggies. And in the US, I would argue that consumer acceptance is really small of an issue. Most people don't care. They like organic, they like in some communities, but the whole GMO fear with the consumer, it's kind of a non-starter in a lot of areas. Um, Now that might seem a little different here because we're within, stone's throw away from Santa Cruz, which is one of the organic anti-GMO headquarters on Earth, as is Berkeley, not very far from here. Some spots in the East Coast, up in Maryland, etc. Very strong anti-GMO consumers. Down in parts of Southern California, in the wealthier outskirts of LA, especially, very, very vocal anti-GMO consumers. But for the most part, you go across the United States and very few people care. There have been a number of tests where this product is GMO. It actually went off the shelves faster than the conventional stuff. People were curious. They weren't scared. Um, but there's something about my tomato, my lettuce. I don't care about GMOs and everywhere else. I'm not worried about it. My corn, whatever. But there's something about my fresh fruits and vegetables, with a couple of exceptions. Why? I don't know. It's an emotional thing because consumers don't seem to give a dang about eating their Doritos and eating their corn oil cooked foods and going and getting a Big Mac or whatever. They don't care. All of a sudden, they care when it's in a tomato. I don't get it. But it's really not the consumer acceptance that's the problem. It's economic acceptance. And that is the issue in the United States, because it only takes one push from one group that wants to boycott. And you get a big group from, I don't know where, Greenpeace, Sierra Club, whoever, I don't care. And I only threw those out because I used to be members of both. And I was highly disillusioned with both of them in the later part of the 80s when they both became corporate stooges and more about money than the truth themselves. Not a big fan of those two groups at the moment. Maybe a little. I like some of the stuff that they do, but a lot of their leadership, especially in I won't even go there. Won't even go there. But it only takes one group to do a boycott, to start something on social media, to catch on fire, and a company can be really heavily hit. Somebody starts spreading lies about, Safeway, and it catches fire, or they just start, even if it's not lies, they just make it sound scary. Safeway's now carrying genetically modified potatoes, and they also have some genetically modified corn and other things, and you don't even know it. You're buying all these dangerous foods on the shelf, and whatever. Somebody says it, and it catches fire on media. What's going to happen? Safeway loses money. And in a single conference room at Hartnell, I'm not talking about the auditorium, just one simple conference room holding 40 people. And you could have a meeting with the top 40 people who control the food in the United States, the food chain, and influence 90% of the food in the entire country. One room. Those are the major decision makers for the corporations that control Walmart and Safeways and these major food chains and other companies like McDonald's. You get 40 of the top decision makers on what products that they will have, whether they're accepting GMOs for certain food lines or not. You get 40 people, and you will have the bulk of the food in the United States. And those 40 people are the ones that are concerned. Those 40 people are the ones who are saying, why should we take the risk? Why should we buy a GMO and take a risk when there's nothing in it for us? What are all the GMO products these days? They're disease resistance for the farmer or drought resistance for the farmer. They're all for the farmer. They're all for the growing. There's nothing to make it better for the consumer, at least not enough that the consumer really cares. And certainly these major economic controllers of our food purchasing and distribution system in the United States, these leaders of the major corporations in our country in charge of the procurement divisions for food and produce, there's nothing in it for them. Why should they buy a GMO when the only advantage is to the grower and the only thing for me is risk? And I can turn right around and buy something for the same price that's non-GMO and not take any risk. The answer is simple. I'm not going to take the risk unless there's something that I can point to that's an advantage, that I can go to my customers and say, look, this is a better product. It stays better on your shelf. It tastes better. Something about it that's better. Otherwise, what's the use? And until we have things that the consumer wants, you and I want to eat it because it's something that we want, then these buyers aren't going to try and buy it. And it's not going to move into our lettuce. It's not going to move into our celery because there's no need for it, at least not yet. Another one of the things that I put down as problems is making no GMO part of organic. Already said it, say it again. I think that was a huge mistake. I think GMOs are a tool that could be used to help the environment, to reduce pesticide use, to help people, to help nutrition, all kinds of things. And those are the kinds of things that typical anti-GMO person wants. Yet we're forbidding a tool, or maybe not forbidding, but we certainly are lobbying strongly against the use of a tool and forbidding it from the use under the GMO label, or excuse me, under the organic label. So we forbid GMOs under the organic label. Why? It's a technique, not a product. Why did we ban the technique when we can't even point to anything that is definitively a GMO product? There is no such thing as a GMO product. It doesn't exist. It's a technique. Why did we ban it without any scientific rationale? I can understand if you would say that GMO can't be an organic. We don't like that GMO. Or that GMO can't be in. But those ones, those are good ones. Those reduce pesticide use. Let's take those. Pick and choose. They do it all the time in organics. They pick and choose which chemicals are allowed to use under the organic approved list. Organic doesn't mean pesticide free. It just means You have a shorter list to choose from. Conventional folks have a long list, organic folks have a short list because certain things are considered too synthetic, whatever, and they don't use them. Anyway, in my humble opinion, GMOs are targeted as a group and unfairly. The techniques are in trial rather than the products. There's a bait and switch arguments used to spread fear about GMO techniques. And I have here bread causes crime. Well, what do I mean by that? Let me say for a moment that we did a survey of convicted criminals in the United States over a 5-year period. And we found that 80% of them ate bread within the previous 24 hours before they committed their crime. 80%! Bread must cause crime, right? Obviously, when almost everybody who causes crime ate bread. Now, that's obviously absurd, right? But you fill in some fearful name, the name of a chemical, dihydrogen oxide is a chemical that was found in the systems of every single serial killer. Now all of a sudden people believe it because it sounds chemically. Oh my God, dihydrogen oxide, that must be some strange brain chemical that makes people go wacko, makes them become serial killers. No, water does not make you go wacko and become a serial killer, but it's the same kinds of arguments that happen all the time. You find two things that happen in a similar time frame, and then you argue that one caused the other, which is a bunch of baloney. You know, people generally brush their teeth in the morning before they get in a fatal car accident. Better stop brushing your teeth. Again, when you dig down, and there's some really skillful ways to hide it, but if you dig down and you understand the fallacious or the erroneous ways people can present science or use logical fallacies, look that up, logical fallacies. There's some great ways to understand when you're being given the classic techniques of misinformation. If you understand it, you can spot it. If you don't understand it, you can be fooled. And you go with your emotion. You go with people that you think have the best interests in mind. Um, and I think a lot of that is because we have poor science literacy, and we're not pushing science to the level that we should. And we have to address that as a society. And I think it's getting so much worse. You know, the earth is flat and autism is caused by vaccines and on and on and on. Things that's like, seriously, if you only knew how to interpret science, there's no truth to those things. And yes, autism is not caused by vaccines. It was a scam that was perpetuated by somebody trying to make money. Everybody knows about the BS scam of some attorney with some scientist who created this phony article trying to create some room for lawsuits. And they got in huge trouble. The paper was pulled, and now decades of people believing it still, even though it was just a swindler and a co-conspirator trying to pull a fast one, and now everybody hears about that kind of BS. And it won't go away. Vaccines cause autism. GMOs are dangerous. As all GMOs are dangerous. Again, it's a technique, not a product. Some GMO products could potentially be dangerous. We have to check and don't approve things that haven't been properly approved, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What are the benefits? I've already talked about BT corn. It certainly reduced the spray of some chemicals, but was it a good thing? I'm not so sure. Virus-resistant papaya and squash, I already talked about that one. Herbicide-resistant crops like Roundup Ready, well, in many cases, they actually reduce the use of even worse and more environmentally dangerous pesticides, herbicides. And in some cases, I think it's a great product. In other cases, I think it's just a way to spray more Roundup. And I'm not a fan of that use. One I haven't talked about is golden rice. And that was a marketing disaster, but it was rice created with vitamin A production. They used a vitamin A gene. And because of the vitamin A production, the rice, instead of being brown rice, it kind of had a golden color. And even the kernel itself, even if you took off the outer brown portion, the outer uh, uh, germ and other parts, and were left with the white interior, it still had a golden color with a hint of vitamin A to reduce blindness in poor countries, primarily in Southeast Asia. Now, it was seen as this major conspiracy against the people of Southeast Asia, and there was chemicals in there to sterilize them so they couldn't have children, and it was evil Westerners trying to infiltrate and do screwy things to the cultures of poor Asian societies and using them as guinea pigs. And no, it was a very hardworking team of researchers at a prestigious university who developed a very early on and extremely successful product in terms of its ability to create rice that would grow in Southeast Asia and prevent blindness. The problem was they didn't understand their consumers. They created a type of rice that was healthy, but it wasn't the types of rice that they grew. If you know about rice, um, saying rice is like saying apples. There's red ones, green ones, big ones, small ones. There's ones with red and yellow. There's golden ones. There's all kinds of varieties of apples. Well, the same thing is true of rice, even though it's not as obvious to the non-rice connoisseur. And some rice is great for making rice pilafs or some other dishes, or Spanish rice, or uh, making fried rice. That's a different kind of rice, or making sushi, very sticky kind of rice. They're different rices that make these products, and this golden rice really sucked at the cooking qualities that they were used to in these countries that really needed it. So they developed a rice that didn't have the qualities they were looking for. They didn't get the buy-in from the um, the political structure and the local community leaders in areas that they wanted to use this. And so again, it was naive efforts of people from the West, not understanding the culture, not understanding their needs from a cooking standpoint or from a cultural standpoint for acceptance, and didn't work in terms of actually implementing it and getting golden rice into the mouths of those starving children who really needed it to prevent blindness. Because if all you get is rice, you're not going to get vitamin A. You go long enough without vitamin A as a young child, you go blind permanently. And it happens to children every day. Um, can you do that with organic rice? Nope. Why do we have to prevent something from being labeled organic and being grown in an organic environment just because somebody put a gene in there that is going to help people? Again, I think it's naive. I think it is, in a way, selfish that our views are narrow, looking through a straw views, that we hate something that we don't understand, and therefore we're going to impose this on other people. And we're going to force it to be organic around the world with no science to back it up, not even a logical explanation. When you dig down into that explanation, there's no freaking logic. I mentioned the flavor saver tomato. I didn't mention it by name, but I did say there was a tomato in the market that got pulled. It was called the flavor saver because they created a gene. They basically took a gene and slowed it down. Still there, but they found a way to slow it down. And by slowing it down, the only thing that gene did was create a protein that triggered the softening of the tomato. Because if you're a tomato in the wild, what do you want to do? You want to ripen, you want to start to get soft, you want to fall on the ground and go splat. And when you go splat, your seeds ooze out, and now you've got a nice, warm, nutritious pile of rotting tomato, and your seeds can start growing. If you are buying a tomato, you don't want splat. You want something that's going to stay firm, and tomatoes should be stored with uh, your other things on the counter outside of the refrigerator. Your tomatoes, for a flavor standpoint, should be in a bowl on the counter in a nice, cool part of the kitchen or something. They store better that way. When they get too cold, they actually start to taste bad. Um, and these flavor saver tomatoes would get ripe with all of the flavor in them and stay firm longer because this one gene slowed down. But they totally screwed it up. In terms of a marketing standpoint, they didn't market it effectively. The people who were doing the test marketing of this were picking them way too early when they were still way too green. And so they ended up tasting bad because they were picked too early. And there were other problems. But um, again, it was a scientist who didn't properly pair their effort with a person who understood marketing, who understood Mexican production facilities, because a lot of these flavor saver tomatoes were being grown in Mexico, and they didn't get the translation very well, and the growers just they grew them like they always grew them. They didn't realize they have to do something different, and it, it was an unfortunate disaster. Even though scientifically it was really cool, and I ate some of them, and they were really good, and they held really well on the counter. I'm not going to get into the competitive bacterial flora other than to say that there have been a number of research efforts to have good bacteria living on your lettuce or strawberries instead of the disease bacteria that can take over and cause problems, or E. coli and make somebody sick. And if you can get the good bacteria more healthy, then you can have a better competitor to outcompete the bad guys. And every single bite of everything you've ever eaten in your life that wasn't sterilized during cooking has bacteria on it. Get over it. That's just true. You eat an apple, you eat lettuce, a salad, it's got bacteria on it. Period. No matter how you washed it. And so you want the good bacteria. You don't want the bad bacteria. We can use GMOs to improve heat tolerance, frost or cold tolerance, low water drought tolerance, salt tolerance. Um, there's something called ice minus bacteria, which helps produce frost protection on certain plants because the bacteria inhibit the formation of ice crystals that can damage the plants. Again, the good bacteria. Developing nations can use GMOs to help. There's a really bad story about GMOs being pushed really hard in a stupid, stupid way in India, and it oversaturated the market, and a lot of Indian farmers went bankrupt. Huge wave of suicides a number of years ago. Big story about how GMOs were devastating Indian farmers and massive losses and suicides and blaming the GMOs. The problem was they pushed way too many farmers to grow a particular type of crop, and they saturated the market, and then the prices crashed. That has nothing to do with GMOs. That's just bad economics. Price goes with supply and demand. And if you think something looks good and sounds good and you push everybody to do it, and all of a sudden supply explodes, prices crash, There are many examples of that happening in history. And the idea that this particular example was with a GMO crop is irrelevant. It wasn't the fact that it was GMO, it was just somebody screwed up big time with supply and demand, and the government didn't step in to stabilize the markets. They allowed the free market to do what it would, which caused people to lose everything. Price crashes, your product isn't worth anything, you lost. Bottom line, general acceptance in fresh foods will require time, education, and compelling traits specifically for the consumer. The consumer has to want it. Otherwise, the buyers aren't going to buy it over the conventional stuff unless there's something the consumer wants. Public awareness must catch up with the science. I would argue we've gone backwards in the last 10 years. I think consumers have gotten less scientifically savvy. I think consumers have been buying into bogus emotional arguments more now than I have seen in a long time. I think we were making great progress in the 60s, 70s, and uh, 80s, and there was something that we kind of started to turn the wrong direction, and science awareness has taken a hit. Scientists must become better communicators. Why is this good? Why is it important? And don't use phrases like GMO, genetically modified organism, Frankenfoods. As traits are developed in superior varieties, the financial reward will eventually outweigh the political risks and buyers will buy it. It's already happening slowly but surely in a lot of things. It's just the last holdouts, that fresh produce aisle. We don't want it in our strawberries and our lettuce, and we don't want it in our blueberries. We just want it in our corn. We want it in some things, but we don't want it in everything. I don't know why. Risks are known. I'm not trying to tell you that GMOs are some cure for everything and that they're wonderful and you should blindly close your eyes and accept everything. Hell no. There are risks and there are things we have to do. We need strong regulation. We need new GMO products, or at least efforts to create GMO products before they ever get into the pipeline to be developed. They should be peer reviewed and critically analyzed. And if it raises any red flags, don't do it. But if it's a good idea and it could help save food waste, it could help grow more crops on poorer soils, if it could help blindness in children, if it could save an industry from a virus, we should be doing these things. That's what science is all about, solving problems. And we put our own obstacles in our own way with some pie in the sky idea that organic is always better. And the naive idea that because something is organic, it automatically is better. Do it the way our ancestors did. They died of food poisoning, they starved, they lost their farms, entire crops being wiped out. Things weren't so rosy back in the day when everything was organic, back in the 16, 17, 1800s and the early 1900s. Everything was supposedly wonderful there. Everything was uh, perfect, and all of this new modern stuff is destroying everything. No, it's another tool. We can use it in good ways or bad ways. Don't try and tell me that organic and going back to the way things were and no chemical inputs is somehow wonderful, when that's not what organic is. And organic does use chemicals, it just uses a smaller list. Anyway, so there's my rant. And I will close by saying this is an important decision. If you're growing something and one of the choices is, do I grow that GMO variety or do I grow that non GMO variety? You need to make a decision. And if you choose to go non GMO, fabulous, as long as you made it for the right decision. It was a good marketing move. The variety you chose is going to be good for you to produce, grow, and sell, and it's going to make you money. It's going to grow well in your area. You've got consumers that want it or customers that want it. Fabulous. Grow what you want to grow. Just don't do the wrong thing, in my opinion, and avoid making a choice of growing something for the wrong reasons because of fear and misinformation. And I don't know what to do about this last part because I'm a little on the fence on it, but there's marketing. How are you going to market your product? And unfortunately, organics are often marketed on fear. And I don't like that. But I understand that is part of their cash cow. And I think it should be based on science. And if you can't sell on the truth and you can't say our product is better and get somebody to buy it, you're doing something wrong. I think it's a slimy, sleazy, and lazy way to sell your product by scaring your consumer, your customer, into buying something because of lies and fear. And that's not going to change anytime soon. I'm going to be dust for millennia probably before the idea of selling from fear goes away. It's just so ingrained in our society. But I won't participate in that. And I hope maybe I won't be dust for millennia. Who knows? Maybe within a generation or two or three, um, we'll have a society that really is more driven by science and the truth and less by misinformation and unfounded fears. I hope. And maybe if people know more and talk about it more, and if you want to talk to me about it, fine. I'm always here. I'll talk to you on the phone. I'll Zoom with you. I'll whatever, to talk this through. Um, but I want more and more people out there that are pushing for the truth, regardless of what it's about.